Hi, everyone. In the previous module, we have looked briefly at the concept need, and we looked at Jonathan Bradshaw's typologies of needs. We considered the concept of felt need, expressed need, comparative need, and even the concept of normative need. Hopefully you've been able to consider those and seeing, how useful they are in relation to social policy and social welfare. Now, in this next recording, we are continuing our discussion on human rights, and we are really considering social policy and social welfare in particular as a human right. And we are again very much drawing on key scholars, including again Jonathan Bradshaw, who's one of the key scholars in this area. So we have this quotation, for example, coming from Bradshaw, that a human rights discourse is by nature a discourse of hope. It concentrates not only on what is wrong, but also articulates a vision or rather different visions of what is right, of where we can be heading. So you can see clearly in this and all the few other slides we shall be unpacking the notion of rights coming into use. So when speaking about human rights, really, the United Nations Human Rights Convention outlines a variety of human rights, which are categorized into first generation, second, and third generation human rights. The idea of generations itself refers to the temporal development and emergence of these rights over time. So when we speak of, the first generation of rights, we are thinking of the earliest, ways of looking at human rights, where people's civil and political rights are being respected. And this is what exactly we are talking about when speaking about first generation human rights, the civil and the political freedoms of people or rights of people. So these have their roots in liberalism and emphasize freedoms from government interventions, often called the negative freedoms, as we said in the previous recordings. And of course, these rights include core rights such as free speech, freedom from discrimination, and political participation, and things like that. And again, these are well established, and especially in the global north countries like where we are. So the second generation human rights emerged later, and these refer to more positive freedoms. These are economic, social, and cultural rights, which are really rooted in socialism and social democracies in particular. So in this context, governments take a more active role in people's lives by trying really to regulate what people do and what they can't do, and trying to provide for citizens rights to education, housing, healthcare, employment, adequate income, and more rights like those. So these rights really are very strong when it comes to welfare states like ours, and they actively provide for the social and economic well-being of all citizens. So if you look at countries like our own country, Australia, and even to some extent the United Kingdom, these second generation rights have been quite well established. So you might also consider then the third generation rights, which are more contested and less universally accepted rights. Things like, um, prosperity, the right to prosperity, the right to the healthy environment, and to economic development, which are all considered, third generation human rights, which to some extent are, are contested, but are still very important to many respects. So in many countries, recent public debates, particularly around climate change, which we shall be considering in week 11, really highlight these rights as younger generations and others advocate for clean air and even clean environment, as being a key human right which cannot be really, disregarded. So the point is, while all these rights are gaining attention, including legal cases where government are challenged for failing to uphold these rights, outcomes are really mixed, reflecting the contested nature of third generations rights in particular. Although, of course, in many contexts, in countries like ours, we very much insist on the first generation and the second generation human rights. So you might also recall us discussing the notion of positive and negative freedoms. We have been discussing about these throughout the last week's modules. So and these mostly really refer mostly to first and second generation rights. So here is really a closer look at those terms when we want to consider what negative and positive freedoms mean. So negative freedoms briefly refers to freedom from government intervention, and you can think really of minus sign as negative freedom, meaning reducing or removing the government's role from your own life. So these freedoms really align very much with civil and political rights, first generation rights, which we have already spoken about. And that in itself emphasizes individual liberties and resisting government intrusion, strongly tied to libertarian values. So positive freedoms, on the other hand, involves government intervention that build capacity. So that would be pictured as a plus sign. So positive freedom means government adds something beneficial to your life instead of rather taking something away from your life. So these freedoms really connect to social and economic rights. And of course, second generation's rights are understood as context where government helps individuals build the capacity to really exercise their political and their civil rights by ensuring access to things like education, housing, and even healthcare. So this concept really closely aligns with, social ideals. And it's very important to consider what it really means when, we are discussing about positive and negative rights. That positive rights mostly is related to social democratic ideals. Now, when we talk about, the social democratic ideals, we also think of social citizenship and the rights it comes with. And so in this, we are really discussing about the idea that people have legitimate claims on the government to have their social, cultural, and, even economic needs met. So this in particular really moves the idea of responsibility from individual alone to the state. And it positions these rights as entitlement based on citizenship rather than conditional status or behavior. So it is very important to consider how, extending citizenship from, rights from just civil and political rights to include social and economic rights. There is really a perspective that everyone should have these rights met, regardless of, who they are or even their behavior and even their status. And to this extent, things like mutual obligations really need to be, to some extent, challenged And these again are very important concepts we have already started considering in week 1. So then the question is, what really happens when instead of granting these rights, basically government, try to do things in a different way, like, needs testing or mutual obligation, where people are obliged to meet certain, criteria to keep benefiting from social welfare. So that's a question we might want to consider, and we might want to keep reflecting on as we move on in this course. So in your workbook, we also have the word desert, which simply means deservedness. So not the sweet treat. It really refers to, people being viewed as worthy of having their needs met by the state based on specific criteria, such as being sufficiently poor or meeting mutual obligation requirements, and these being themselves like the key criteria of social welfare delivery processes. So, for example, in welfare programs like job seeker payments in Australia, there is this assumption that individuals must demonstrate they meet income and asset threshold and also comply with mutual obligations like, attending job interviews and volunteering and really demonstrating that they are doing an effort to get a job in order for them to keep benefiting from the system. So you might want to consider, what does that mean? Does it mean then people's needs are not being addressed, but people are being considered as, deserving the services rather than, needing them? Again, all those are key considerations you might want to keep reflecting on. So another question is this question of deservedness and the question of merit, and how different political ideologies get really to influence that. So the extent to which deservedness is used in welfare assessment varies across political ideologies, and most countries blend welfare claims based on both social citizenship and the notion of desert, which we had already spoken about. So it's rarely really all or nothing, but exists somewhere on a spectrum. And it's always like a mixture of many things. And we see this very often in the Australian context, for example, where some welfare claims are based on social citizenship. That's, things like universal health care through Medicare, where everyone almost gets, the same thing, or even public education, where access is broadly granted. But we still have welfare claims like Social Security, which move closer to desert-based principles, even in Australia here, as shown in our means testing and mutual obligation principles, which we had discussed again earlier, and which we started speaking about even in week 1. So what this really tells us is that different policy areas fall at different points on this spectrum between social citizenship and deservedness. It's not something which is just fixed, but keeps changing depending on different needs. So you might now want to consider which of S.P. Anderson's welfare regimes would be more likely to emphasize welfare claims based on merit or deservedness. So hopefully you've been able to think of, liberal welfare, which really stands out here as, meeting this criteria in, S.P. Anderson's welfare regimes. So liberal welfare states requirement, it really requires people to prove they deserve welfare using welfare as a last resort, say, not just, benefiting from welfare safety without, having that merit of getting it. So in contrast, if we were to think of social democratic regimes, we would think of that as placing greater emphasis on meeting people's rights through social citizenship rather than, desert. So to really illustrate this further, we might think of, liberal welfare states like, the US, where there is a stronger expectation that individuals would be, to some extent, meeting their needs through personal responsibility in the market rather than government support. And again, you see this debate very much dominating the welfare ideologies in that part of the world. Thank you very much and see you in the next module.